All right. Thank you so much, Dr. McLaren. As always, I'll be doing the literature review segment for the Dental Raves and Rants podcast. As you would know from the first episode, we discussed surface treatment of different zirconia and some in vitro research we have done so far and some published literature out there. And also we raved and ranted. Today, we would be discussing more about zirconia bonding and then what's the current literature look like and what's the research gap that we need to still work upon. So let me move on to my next slide here. So question of the decade actually is to resin bond or to cement a restoration, isn't that so? And then there are different bonding protocols and surface treatments based on the material used. For example, the silica-based glass ceramics are surface treated differently as opposed to some of the high crystalline polyceramic materials. So we discussed surface treatment of zirconia last time, how it was different on the 3Y versus 4Y and the 5Y materials. So getting into and deep diving into the resin bonding. So resin bonding actually is ideal for silica-based glass ceramic materials and which has been well documented with long-term clinical success in the literature. Whereas clinical recommendations for resin bonding of high-strength polycrystalline ceramics such as zirconia mainly rely on in vitro studies. And see how I underlined it over there. So we heavily rely on in vitro studies, and I think this is going to be the main rant we are going to make today. But I will leave the ranting and raving to the experts out here. Moving on to the next slide. So this is a critical review article by Blatz and team that was published in 2018 in Journal of Dental Research, and basically it critiques several clinical studies published on resin bonding of ceramics, but it also discusses both glass ceramics, silica-based, alumina-based ceramics, and then the zirconia ceramics. And looking into this critical review, we can say it's recently published. So as at the time of publication of this review, the long-term clinical studies existing for glass-infiltrated alumina were quite a bit, as you can tell. Densely sintered alumina, there was a retrospective study done by Sorrentino in 2012 that investigated thin implant-supported crown. But today's topic, we are not interested as much as in the glass-infiltrated alumina, but we are interested in zirconia. So looking at long-term clinical studies at the time of publication of this review, these are some of the prospective and retrospective clinical trials, retrospective studies, and let me put it this way, prospective clinical trials, and mostly they are based of resin bonded fixed dental prosthesis. And a very important publication comes out from the group from Germany, Kern et al., and they did several publications and have data up to 10 years of long-term systematic investigations into bonding of single-winged RBFPDs, and we'll deep dive into that publication in a second. But just to get your attention, there have been some prospective studies looking at fixed dental prosthesis of zirconia with a composite resin cement and a self-adhesive resin cement. But at the same time, framework fracture was the main mechanical complication observed, and not so much has been investigated for a tooth-supported crown except for one retrospective study that investigated a zinc phosphate cement and self-adhesive resin that was done in 2012 as well. And then out of that study, as you can see from the table, 12.5% debonded, 6.6% also debonded. We have to deep dive into that paper, sorry about that. Okay. Then deep diving into this paper, which is a 10-year outcome of zirconia ceramic cantilever, resin bonded fixed dental prosthesis with single wing, and the influence of the reasons for missing incisors. We are not interested in the reasons of the missing incisors, but we are interested in the 10-year outcomes. So this is probably the best you can get in terms of a long-term clinical evidence paper for zirconia, believe it or not. This paper is based off of 87 patients and 108 RBFDPs, all single-winged. Observation time was 10 years. 6 debondings and 1 loss of restoration was observed. And so this paper concluded the 10-year survival rate of 98.2% and 10-year success rate of 92%, so which is pretty great. There's another paper by Matthias Kern that actually talks about bonding to oxide ceramics, such as zirconia, and then compares the laboratory testing, which we are heavily relying on, versus clinical outcomes, especially when it comes to partial coverage restorations. There is no short, mid, or long-term clinical evidence or a prospective trial investigating the resin bonding to inlays, onlays, and veneers. Are people doing it? Yes, and that's what we're going to rant about today. So recommendation based on these published clinical trials. We also discuss the in vitro side of it. We know air abrasion with 50 microns alumina particles at 0.1 to 0.25 MPa pressure creates a good surface for bonding, and then an MDP or 10 MDP containing monomer or a ceramic primer will give you the chemistry or the chemical coupling for bonding to a zirconia surface. And then you can use any luting resin cement to create that adhesion between the restoration, the zirconia restoration in the tooth. This again is from the Blatz paper in 2018. As you can see, this limited scanning electron microscopic imaging, I must say, investigates without any surface pretreatment. The resin zirconia bonding interface reveals wide open gaps and only limited adhesion. And I think you can see my cursor over here. So that's the gap that you see. And then the second image on the right, you can see that air particle abrasion of the zirconia surface with alumina particles at 50 microns, 2-bar pressure, and application of a 10 MDP containing ceramic primer actually gives you a adequate chemical bond, we can say an optimized adhesive surface as reported by this paper. Then moving on, let's rave and rant. So the resin bonded FDP's single retainer show the long-term clinical success, and that has been published in a 10-year outcome study. Great, we can rave about it. But the problem is, I'm going to rant a little and then leave the ranting to the experts, that there is no long-term clinical data for resin bonded partial coverage monolithic zirconia restorations, and I underlined it again for you, such as inlay, onlay, or veneer. So who generates the clinical evidence? We do, but do we have it yet? We don't. So that brings me to the question of this episode. What are the current trends of zirconia partial coverage restorations? And from this, here I would like to end my literature review segment and off to the experts for raving and ranting. Thank you for your attention.
Well, that was great.
That's amazing.
Well done. Maybe I'll start with let me share the screen, okay? Because I had a couple similar slides I dropped into something that might emphasize. Hang on a second. Let's see. So I'll need to share the screen. So this was an interesting paper, and you touched on this a little bit. So this is the only real meta-analysis I could find of, let's say, zirconia bonding. It has a little alumina stuff in there, okay? So where it's a meta-analysis of clinical papers, and it used single wings or double wings or whatever, but that's still adhesive, okay? And like you said, there's no real great data out there on inlays, onlays, or crowns that any of us could find. So here was an interesting thing. Now, Matthias Kern is one of the pioneers of zirconia bonding. So he in two 10-year studies, two different studies, he had zero failure of the bond. Now, he did have some failures because the wing cracked or zirconia cracked or alumina cracked, whatever, okay? But that's a different problem, okay, that it overloaded the prosthesis. But let's look down here at some other people. Gallus, Stados, or Sassi, or Irina Saylor. Okay, she had 13% debonding at 53 months, a little bit over 4 years. Somebody else had 46% debonding over 12 months. Okay, so what that basically tells us, and they've all followed protocols that we all know, we've sandblasting, everything was either sandblasted or Rocketech, so that the variability is extremely high among the studies. So you have one author that had zero, and so maybe he's got the technique down, and maybe if we looked at his preparations, he put some more macro-mechanical retention in, all right? And so what we see is we don't see this kind of failure with etched ceramics. It just doesn't happen. I mean, the reported failure rates are 1-2% maybe, if that, okay? Fracture, that's a different issue. All right, so really, here's what's happening, okay? So we might as well go into this right here, okay? All right, so what I did was looked at different surfaces. We've done some stuff on this over the years, okay? So let's just go ahead and do this right now. What should we do on the internal surface? Now, John Burgess, and I was part of this et al., looked at the distinction between how much of bond strength would come from just the chemistry of the MDP primer and how much would come from the sandblasting. And he found that roughly 30% better bond strength came from aluminous oxide. But this was on machine surfaces. So machine surfaces already have a little bit of roughness. So I was very interested to look at what happened between a smooth surface, and I'll just fast forward to that right now. Just some other stuff we did over time, okay? So what we did was we polished zirconia surfaces and cleaned them very well. So they were super clean, okay? So they were polished to 2000 grit smoothness. And then we put MDP primer on there on 4 different companies. I don't want to beat any of the companies up right now, okay? And we looked at, and then I put cement on there, and we looked at, okay, the cement or composite with an MDP primer, but with no sandblasting. The average bond strength of the 4 materials was 4 megapascals. We had several specimens that popped off. They were 0 megapascals. You breathed on them and they popped off. So the chemistry alone is giving, yes, it's giving some bond strength, because if we put zinc phosphate on a smooth, perfectly smooth surface, or glass ionomer on a perfectly smooth surface, it would blow off too. So there was a little bit of bond strength. I said, okay, now, so that was pure smooth. That was different than what Burgess did as machined. As machined, we're going to get pretty much what you're going to see here, okay? So then we looked at it, said, okay, and we looked at 4 different materials. We made 6 specimens each. We threw out any variables that maybe we screwed up or something, okay? So then we sandblasted the surface of zirconia. Just look at the flat surface of zirconia, and then no bonding agent, and then just put the cement on, or put composite on. I looked at the composite cement. They basically behave the same, where we condensed it through a little hole. I'll show you the video in just a second. All right, about 7 megapascals, plus or minus, down to maybe 4 or 3 and up to 10 or 11. So there was a fairly wide range. Okay, then the third group was classically what people would do. They would sandblast, put an MDP primer on, and we got roughly around 15-ish megapascals, plus or minus. Some of the specimens up around 20 megapascals bond strength, okay? Some of the specimens maybe down around 10. All right, then I thought about this, and this is the way I've been doing it for years. If I'm going to bond zirconia, is I would do the sandblasting, clean the surface, of course, then put the MDP primer on. But the MDP primer, I was a little bit concerned, didn't completely wet the surface. The MDP primer bonds to an oxide on one side and bonds to a resin on the other side. So I just put a low viscosity resin, so just a regular bonding agent that you'd put on the surface of your glass or surface of a tooth or something like that. Then the cement on the top. That got the best bond strength. So we were up close to 20, 19, 18 megapascals. All right, so now here's the super interesting thing, was it was 100%. Every one of those, all 4 materials, it was 100% failure, were adhesive failures. So in other words, it just pulled the bonding agent off. Now, Anvita, I do need to get you these specimens, and we'll work on that, because clearly if we look at it in an SEM, we might see a little thin layer of resin. Okay, but visually and under a microscope, I didn't see anything but zirconia, maybe a little tag or 2 of resin. All right, now, great. Okay, so what does that mean relative to what we've already had before? Okay, we've had glasses, right, that we etch, whether it's be a porcelain, a glass ceramic, Empress, or Emax. And so I did some specimens of everything, but I got all 4 systems with Empress blocks, okay, which are around 150 megapascals, pretty strong stuff. But it's etchable with a hydrofluoric acid. All right, now, we already saw this, okay, it was 100% failure adhesively. All right, so I think it was 8 or 10, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it doesn't matter, because we got enough specimens and we saw the behavior, okay? This was going to turn into a full paper, and the reason why I can't give you all the exact numbers is because Anvita is going to be doing the full paper on all this data with really, really good statistics, but with your eyes, you can see some of these things. So the interesting thing is we were up around 35 megapascals on the etched Empress. Very similar on Emax, okay? So they almost behave the same, but fascinating. Here's the complete difference of what happened. The specimens ripped out a piece of the glass. That's true bonding. So when we're having an adhesive failure, is that really bonding, or is that just really good cement? Okay? All right, so let me just show you here what I mean. Here's what the specimen looked like on the zirconia. Nothing was attached. So here's a close-up view of all of and this was using all the steps I just said. The zirconia, the sandblasting, the MDP primer, the bonding agent, and then the cement, okay? And we use an ultradent shear test. You don't need to see all this stuff, but we bonded a rod on here. We sheared it off on the side. I could show you a bunch of videos later if you're interested. All right, 100%. I mean, yeah, you could microscopically see there's a little adhesion. Let's look over here. I got fun. I just put a video in here because I want to rotate that so you can see that.
Out the Emax, or Empress,
It totally ripped out the glass. There was no failure adhesively. And the 20% higher bond strength, okay? Now, yeah, we've already seen all this stuff. So here's the point. Let me go ahead and back out of that, see if there's another slide I want to show you here. So I do not believe that we have true zirconia bonding. I am not quite sure where all this stuff is coming from. I'm reading these numbers. I read in a Gordon Christensen CR newsletter, 70 megapascals in some specimens. I would love, I'm not trying to disprove anything, Miguel. I know you're not either, and I know we're going to rant about this in a minute. But we all hear, and I realize this is pure anecdote, okay? We hear across the board when we're talking to people that are good clinicians, they're still occasionally having some zirconia crowns pop off, even though they're using an MDP primer. Well, now we see the reason why. Truly,
the problem that you're having is that you're still listening to Gordon Christians.
Yeah, that could be true. Okay, that could be true too. Okay, and yeah, I mean, let's face it. Okay, so but the other side of that, I just showed you. I mean, I could show you about 100 specimens that it was 100% adhesive failure, and so that makes sense. It makes sense to me that most of the bond strength in zirconia is coming from at least half, not just 30%, half. Maybe 60 or 70% is coming from the sandblasted surface. And we showed that last time. Anvita showed that last time, that you get, even with a 3Y material, the surface is a little bit rougher. Okay, after you sandblast it, the 5Y is definitely rougher. Nothing like etched glass. So anyway, now I'm also looking at a new material, by the way, that we'll get some data. It's over here on my desk, that we're going to pre-etch the zirconia prior to sintering it. So we'll get a nice rough surface, and I'll let you know how that's going to do. So anyway, so let's just summarize then for the audience that's watching. Yeah, you should be, if you're using zirconia for a short clinical prep, if you're using zirconia for a non-retentive prep, which I don't believe you should do anymore, okay? But you should put some macro-mechanical retentive elements, maybe a mesial and distal box. If you're going to do a veneer, maybe a mesial and distal groove. If you're doing a lingual wing for a Maryland bridge, a depression in the cingulum, maybe a little box form, okay? And then I think you should sprinkle some holy water on it when you're done and pray, okay? Now, the other side of that, you could say, is the worst thing that's going to happen, it's going to pop off. We don't see too much fracture, but we did here. We saw a little fracture in this paper that I was showing. So to me, I mean, we just don't see glass ceramics break. I'm not seeing it monolithic. Yeah, okay, you can hear somebody out there tell you one or two broke, but nothing like the debonding issue with this material. So to summarize, and then I want you to jump in, buddy, my rant bro out there, is that if you're doing minimalistic, non-retentive preps, it should be some form of glass. And the only decision on which form of glass is the strength that you need. That's just, I think that's an absolute today. And then beyond that, okay, bridges, yeah. Okay, for zirconia bridges or a subgingival margin on a second molar.